Is English racist? Some people would say that it is. Some people would say that it's not. I would say that I do not know enough about this subject to have an informed opinion. So, to help me, I've invited Kritika Sharma, who's going to be educating me on this topic. Welcome, Kritika.
Hi, thank you, Robert. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming. So, I'm excited, and I know the viewers are excited to get into this topic, but I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself. So, let them know who are you and tell us about your YouTube channel as well.
Sure, I would love to. I want to start this by saying I'm a forever student, so I'm so excited to be here and talk about these topics because I'm really interested in all of them, but I'm definitely learning just as much as everyone else is. So I'm hoping to get interesting comments and questions and interact with the audience. I guess I describe myself as a language and culture nerd and aspiring video journalist. I went to college for international studies and linguistics, and my concentration in international studies was human rights. And what I liked the best about this field was really seeing how these two fields really interact with each other. I was often told that linguistics and international studies is very different. But to me, like world issues are inextricably linked to people's cultures, and language is one of the biggest part of people's cultures. So being able to like really research that, learn more about that in the world has been one of my favorite things. So I have a YouTube channel as well, and it's all about language, culture, and spreading love, as I like to say. And there's a few other kind of storytelling things in there, but I'm trying to be more consistent. And basically, I enjoy researching topics related to language and culture, kind of breaking down um, any little like perceptions that you might have or anything that you might have not thought of related to these topics. And yeah, I'm that's a it's a way for me to honestly learn. It's a way for me to connect with cool people like Robert, and just encourage everyone to have more compassion for other people's cultures, have more compassion for the people around them, and really never stop learning about the people around you. So that's a little bit about me. Yeah, and I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. It sounds like we definitely have some similar goals with our channels. Obviously, I'm focusing on language, in particular the English language, but I'm all about spreading the love. And I think we're going to have a good talk here. I definitely don't know as much about the culture, and I didn't study linguistics other than a few classes. So I'm excited to learn what you have to teach me about this topic. Yeah, are you ready to get into it here?
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay, so just to frame this, I would like to know when people say that English is a racist or sexist or classist, I want to know what is it exactly that means? Because I know that some people have different ideas of what racism is. Does it have to do with prejudice or prejudice and power? So I was curious about what your definition is and what I guess the general definition would be for somebody who's saying that, and also I want to know where they're coming from. What are they noticing about the language that brings them to that conclusion? So, where would you like to
Yeah.
start?
I definitely can't say I have like a one size fits all definition, but when you mention these questions, what comes to mind is what people think language is and what language really is, where a lot of people have this perception that language is just the words that you're saying, but in reality, linguists like to say it's something that you do, and everything about language is very much a choice. And language is, encapsulates body language and it encapsulates what you're saying and also what you're not saying, what you're choosing to say, how you're saying it, your tone. And so I think with English, the way I like to think of it, at least in the racism context, is you can kind of break it down into three different categories. You can think about how English words are racist, which I feel like is the least interesting and most obvious part of English and racism. And this can probably come up with any language where there's slurs, there's derogatory terms. These are very obvious examples of racism. And in many parts of I'm only experienced with English in the US, honestly, um, as like a lived experience. So in the US, in many parts, this is like less and less common, which is great. But I think what's more interesting to talk about, as at least in the racism context, is like how are English speakers perhaps racist and how does that get projected onto their language?
Mm.
And then how is English as an entity how could the English language as an entity be racist? Um, yeah.
And just to clarify, so if we're talking racism, um, I remember when I was doing my undergrad, for sure, is what the first time that I came across an alternative definition of racism, at least alternative from what I had known before, whereas I thought of racism as prejudice against someone because of their race. And then I learned that some people will actually view racism strictly as prejudice of somebody of a different race if they have power. And I was just curious if
Mm.
you leaned one way or the other, or if this conversation is going to be coming from one of those perspectives or the other.
I think I definitely like I recognize the sentiment of the power because that is definitely very pertinent in especially Western societies that speak English, and most of the examples will have to do with racism against people who have lesser power. But I also, in some ways, like to push back against that because I don't like to kind of solidify the idea that in an interaction, one person inherently holds the power.
Mm.
I know in societies people may learn that they have lesser power, but I think language is very much I like to call it like a democratic process. There is a lot of people that feel that language is set in stone, like language should be a certain way, but in reality, language is always changing. And by saying that actually everyone has power, that gives so many people the agency to feel that this is their language. They can express their lived experience through this. And I think with English, that becomes really important because English is spoken by so many people outside of just the Western world. And its like role as a language is really evolving. So I wouldn't say I lean one way or the other, but I think both perspectives are really important for sure.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So you said that the actual language being racist is the least interesting. Did you want to get into that at all to start?
Honestly, like I barely have thoughts on this because it's for me it's just okay, there are words that are racial slurs, there are derogatory terms. You're told that these are wrong. And that's the extent of it. I talked a little bit about this in this like video I have that's called The Linguistics of Racism. And you know, there is an element of that that people tend to omit. I think one thing that is important to realize about derogatory terms is that they do hurt people. It's not just like a I think there's like an idea that some people like to use derogatory terms to be funny or like their idea of humor is can be racist and it's like, oh, it's just humor.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
but I think that's the one area that it really does come into, whereas like there is a certain line that you shouldn't cross because I think the example I took in that video was like we don't hit people because they don't react to it. We don't hit people because it's wrong, regardless of how someone reacts to it or not. So I think that's the only thing that I would say like really is important to keep in mind with racism in everyday language is that I think especially growing up, like I would come across a lot of examples of humor being kind of racist or racially colored, and it's important to stray away from that. I think,
Yeah, I
but I
definitely
think
feel like our parents' generation had
yeah,
a little bit more of that going on. I certainly remember a lot of family get-togethers where there were different kinds of jokes than I hear today. And interestingly enough, like a lot of those family members that I see today, like those jokes aren't being said. So even though they are they grew up in the time where it was more acceptable, they've kind of caught on like, oh, like it's not okay for us to say this now, which is nice to see.
yeah, and that's honestly like where it comes in of the this racism doesn't have to necessarily do with who has power because like I grew up in an immigrant community. So there were not that many like white people in where I lived, but there were still many people that would still make racist jokes. And in that case, like in the traditional sense of how we view power in the US, um, it was the people that have lesser power. And so if you look at it with the power definition of racism, you would be like, oh, this is not wrong, like it's
Mm.
okay. But I think I like to push back against that because just because you've been hurt by a group of people doesn't warrant hurting them back. I don't think that really helps anyone. Even though, it feels like injustice, it feels like you've been wronged. I think at the end of the day, it's important to keep that aspect of compassion and spreading love and like really having that integrity. Um, but yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how English speakers. I don't. The word racist is very loaded,
Yeah.
and I there's not a good alternative for it. But I think I started noticing a lot of how my peers or people around me could be like racist, for lack of a better term, with their language without even knowing it because of the way they speak and because of what they have normalized. Um, I so when I lived in Seattle, that was the first time I really been in a community that wasn't so immigrant saturated as where I grew up. And I would notice that English is almost treated as this neutral language, as if English represents this absence of culture. And I felt like people's perspectives really reflected that in the way that I felt like as a first gen immigrant, like my experiences were definitely not asked about and people didn't really have interest in culture and there was this discomfort with culture as if that's not something that we talk about, like we're all Americans, we all speak English. um, and I don't know if you've ever had any sort of similar experience, but that's kind of when I started noticing like, oh, there is a more deeper element to this prejudice that we have in the English language.
You said when you moved to Seattle.
Hmm.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I would definitely consider Seattle to be, a very liberal place. Um,
Yeah.
could you unpack a little bit about what you said when you said that they seem uncomfortable with culture? I'm curious about that. I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think one of the best examples that I feel like people can relate to is with dating. Um, Across the world, dating looks so different. Everyone has different comfort levels with it. People have different perceptions of dating, whether it's okay or not. And I've had situations where friends have, talked about dating as like in our parents' generation. Um, and I would try to be like, our parents may be the same age, but that is the only thing similar about their experiences, Like my parents grew up in India, dating is very different there. And um, it's I would try to explain that it's like our perceptions of these things are culturally different. And there was almost like a shut off at the conversation. Like there was almost like a no, but like, we're both American. Like we have the same perception of this. We have the same experience of this. It's really hard to articulate. It's like it sounds that's why I think it's so embedded and so hard to catch. And I've only caught these things sometimes after reflecting on them. Like, oh, that person didn't dig into my lived experience. They didn't dig into what my perceptions of dating were. They just assumed that what their experience was is the default. Um, yeah, I
Yeah,
think
you had a
with
good video about this topic too. Um,
yeah, that's kind of where I unpack this, where like uh, a lot of our language is very white experience focused, and I think that's a really great place to start unpacking how English is racist because it's in ways that we don't even realize. There's a lot of like hobbies or things that people do that are very much like gatekept by finance. And in the US, generational wealth is very much in white communities. It's centered in white communities. And as you go down the line of different immigrant communities, people don't have generational wealth. People don't have so much income. They have to send remittances. They are trying to make ends meet. So they will not be part of these communities. They will not talk about golfing and having like really fast cars. And, these are just not things that are my experience. And I think people don't realize that when they talk about these things, they're talking about white culture. And they don't realize that when I try to talk about my culture, it's not separate from me. It is me because when other people talk about their lived experience, that is not removed from them. That is them.
yeah.
And I think that is one of the biggest aspects of English being quote unquote racist. I think that I can identify.
When you talk about English being, what did you say? Just like sort of a lack of culture? I'm
Hmm.
curious, do you feel like there's anything in particular about English, or would you think that that would be kind of the norm in any country with the dominant language? I won't say the official language because English is not the official language of this country. But if you're in a
Yeah.
place where you have a dominant language, do you think that there's anything that distinguishes English from those? Because, like, when I was in Thailand, for example, the Thai language was a lack of culture for them because it's just, you've been sitting in the hot tub so long, you're used to the heat, so you don't, or if you're like in a room, you can't smell the room because you've been in it too long. Do you think it's
Yeah.
that sort of a thing, or do you think there might be something more going on with the English language in particular?
So that's a really interesting question. And I have a couple of thoughts. One is that I think with English, the role that it plays is very different than other languages. In English, so I was listening to a very interesting podcast. I'm going to probably name drop a lot of different resources because, like I said, I'm just always learning about these things. And I think it's Rough Translation has an episode called How to Speak Bad English. And they talk about, interestingly enough, they talk about an English teacher who used to try to like who's would market being able to give people an American accent and being able to get rid of their native accent.
Mm.
And they and her perspective slowly evolved to, oh, maybe we should train English speakers to be more perceptive of different people's accents rather than to change second language speakers of English. And they give an interesting stat in this, which was there's about 400 million native speakers of English and 2 billion people that are learning English. And I think that really puts into perspective the role that English plays, in that it is a global language now. And maybe, 300, 400 years ago, you could say that English was the language of people in the UK or something. Um, but now that has shifted. We can't no longer say that English is owned by these Western countries. English is not owned by the US, UK, Canada. Sorry, there's been a sound.
There's chaos. It's all right.
Okay, I'm gonna wait for it to pass.
While you're waiting for that, I just want to address you guys who are commenting. We'll have a Q&A section coming up here maybe halfway through, maybe once we're done talking about racism or something. But yeah, I'll check in and we can answer you guys' questions and also maybe read out some of these comments for you.
Yeah, sorry about that. But so when we think about that disparity, 2 billion versus 400 million, then you start to realize like English is a language that is not owned by Western countries, and therefore we can't treat it with an absence of culture because actually English is a meld of all cultures. There are so many countries that speak English either as a first language or people like know English as a dominant language in their society. Countries like India is a really good example. Singapore is another good example where English is very much their language just as much as the language of their country. So, in your example with Thailand, yes, it's perhaps an absence of culture, but that is with the shared understanding that most people who speak Thai are Thai. But people that speak English are not often combined, like don't have this shared experience of culture. English is a language that brings together so many other cultures. So it's almost even more jarring that a language that is full of different cultures, all of our words are taken from so many different languages. That language can't be an absence of culture. That language has to be so accommodating because it's kind of like you can't have your cake and eat it too, in the way that you can't want English to be a global language and then want everyone to assimilate into one standard English culture. If you want it to be a global language, it needs to the way you like receive English, the way you perceive English needs to have a global focus as well.
Amen. Sorry, I really jive with everything you're saying. I'm trying to keep my opinions out of this, but everything that you're saying is like it's where my heart is.
Yeah.
I can't remember if it was called the circles of the English language. You know what I'm talking about? There's like an inner circle, an outer circle, expanding circle, but basically there's the concept of world Englishes rather than just, UK or British English, American English, Australian English. You have world Englishes where they've categorized some countries, I think India is one of them, into what's called the expanding circle because so many people are learning English from a young age that they have their own dialect. And like, as you were saying, language is ever changing. It's not something that we create, it's something that we perceive. And if it's being used in this way by millions of people, then that's also proper English. So I really agree with what you're saying. And I've talked about this in a couple of my videos, but for me, it's really difficult because I know a lot of my students want to learn how to sound like a quote unquote native speaker from America, which I am, so I can provide that. And, it's probably good to choose one dialect and aim for it. Otherwise, you're going to get confused. But at the same time, I think it's really important that my students know, like, whatever dialect you choose, it's going to be just as acceptable. Like, there's nothing that makes one dialect more correct than another. Even if you're learning English from, somebody who lives in the Philippines. I would almost argue that the Philippines, like, people who are learning English are native speakers. Like, have you been speaking English since you were a child? You're a native speaker. So anyway, I could go on forever. That might be something I want to talk about with you on your channel, but I'd rather hear what you have to say.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting story that you bring up because I think this also touches into another idea of kind of how English language as a concept can be racist. Is there is this perception that every language has the same amount of you can say the same things in each language. Like people will often ask me like, how do you say this in Hindi, assuming that there is a word for this in Hindi.
Yeah.
Often there is, but often there is not, because language comes from people's cultures. So in that way, I think that's where another one of those perceptions comes from, that the English that you learn in other countries is not considered proper English, is not native English, because English has the status of being like a literary language and very professional and so many fancy words. Like you have so many ways of saying things. And it's great. It's really awesome. As a native English speaker, I feel like I can express myself very thoroughly in English. But at the same time, like, the way that I can express myself in Hindi is so different. The way I express myself in French is so different. And I think that's another perception that people hold that is a little bit racist, is that because English speakers from other countries won't know the same breadth of vocabulary, they won't have the same breadth of expression, they don't know English. They don't fully know English. When in reality, every language in the world has different kind of scopes of what you can express, different scopes of how tone and expression and like different nonverbal communication plays into their language. And that's what makes the language full. A huge lexicon does not make a language full.
That's a cool way to think about it. You're getting me thinking about like instruments, right? Even if you have a piano with 88 keys, let's say theoretically you had a guitar that could play all those notes as well, you would still have a completely different tone coming out of the guitar, and you could say the same things, like the same string of notes, the same chords with both instruments, but they would sound different and they would express themselves differently. That's cool. Yeah. I only know like a little bit of Spanish, but I know that whenever I speak Spanish, like I have a different personality. I'm like, ooh, like Spanish Rob's coming out. This is fun. So exactly, I get what you're saying in that sense. Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I like that.
And honestly, I was curious because I feel like I will tend to jump into the global side of things. But I'm curious to know, like, did you have any background in learning that English can be a little racist? Like, what was your kind of introduction into this topic?
As far as racist goes, not much. I remember in college there was, and I don't know if this is still something that's happening, but I remember there was a school that was trying to get rid of the term master's degree because they thought it was racist. They thought master's degree, um, is referring to masters and slaves.
Hmm.
So that's one example that I could think of as far as racism goes. Another one would be what I would maybe think of more as classism, where certain pronunciations of words are not acceptable in the academic field or at a place of work. When I say not
Hmm.
accepted, I mean like sure they're accepted, but also I'm like secretly thinking like, oh, like this person doesn't know how to talk, like pronouncing the word ask as axe, for example.
Hmm.
So that's a little bit of the exposure that I had to English being racist. But I think I would agree with you that there's racism happening, but it's not the language that's racist, but people are, I don't know, using it in a racist way. It's really hard to pinpoint what's going on there, but that's a little bit of my exposure and like what I learned back in my undergrad.
Yeah, and you touch on like one of the main things that people will usually start with when talking about English possibly being racist is that idea of standard English. And I guess this does type into like global Englishes as well. But um, because English has such a place in professional contexts, there's almost this understanding that there is a standard English, which linguists like to say is a myth, you know. Um, we don't like to say that there is a standard English because it's very much used to kind of discriminate against people based on the based on how they sound. Really, it's not their command of English. I mean, if you have friends from other countries, you'll know that these people probably speak English incredibly well, despite any accent, despite any grammatical mistakes. Um, and yeah, standard English is like one of the bigger myths of the English language that I think is like the most common example people take of English being racist. Because it also goes into the domestic aspect of how is people's schooling, where did people grow up, and how does that reflect onto their language, which is then being used to discriminate against them um, in the workplace, in their professional careers, in their lives. Um, so yeah, I just thought I'd throw that in to make sure I don't like forget about that.
Yeah. Well, sounds like we've come across some similar ideas in that regard.
Hmm. And I honestly, we can't close the topic of racism in English without touching on Black English vernacular. That's a very, very pertinent thing in the United States. And it's one of the aspects of racism that is much more overt still in this day and age, which really sucks. So, Black English vernacular, for anyone who doesn't know, is the some people say it's a dialect, some people say it's a language, but the form of English that a lot of Black communities speak. And it's still, there's still so many people that call it bad English and say it's incorrect grammar. But grammar is the heart of language. Like, you can't have a language without grammar. And Black English vernacular has a grammar. It has a modified grammar structure that's, evolved through the Black community and has become its own way of communication. And there's people that code switch, people that speak standard English in the workplace to be accepted, and then they will speak Black English vernacular with their family because that's their culture. That's how they express themselves fully. And that's definitely one of the most tangible aspects of racism in English. It's not covert at all. There have been court cases even regarding Black English vernacular because I think in places like Oakland and Ann Arbor, where children would go to school and be taught that their language is wrong,
Mm,
um, rather
yeah.
than being told, this is your dialect, but this is the dialect we're learning in school, or it's not very accommodating either way. So and I'm not an expert on this. I went into this concept more in that linguistics of racism video and really just talking about how Black English vernacular is um, a very obvious example of how the way people speak affects our perception of them. Because there's a lot of people that will still tell Black people, like, oh, you sound smarter than other Black people that I've met if they
Mm.
speak standard English rather than BEV, or you don't, you sound different, or I didn't expect you to talk like that. which are still very overt examples of racism in the English language.
Now I want to learn all about. When I was taking my linguistics course, I think it was AAVE, but is it changing to BVE, or is it like up for debate? Is the
So
term that people are
yeah,
using?
I think it goes to the like Black versus African American
Yeah,
argument. I'm not sure if there's a more accurate term. I think Black is just more encompassing of everyone because a lot of people are not African, but they're Black, um, from
yeah.
like West Indies or like South America. So I'm not sure if they're different either. Like I'm not sure if there are distinctions between people with African heritage and otherwise.
Yeah, I was just curious because I know there's a lot of word wars and like term wars. Like when
Yeah,
I was doing my master's degree, um, it wasn't ESL, it was ESOL, you know, because we wanted to specify. We don't know if this is our student's second language. It might be their third or fourth or fifth language. So speakers of other
yeah,
languages, and I know that there's always like a constant like battle of like, all right, well now this term's not good. We got to switch to this term. I was just curious because again, I only took one linguistics class, so I was wondering what's going on. What's the what's the scoop?
yeah. And honestly, that's like word wars are always like really. I feel like that's you said like, oh, Seattle's a very accepting place. I think Seattle is a place of word wars rather than sometimes they don't get.
So that's very liberal.
Um, yeah, yeah. It's a place of a lot of word wars, and sometimes I feel like we don't get into like the meat of stuff. It's just about being politically correct on the surface. But there are some word wars that I do think is very valid, like that English as another language, um, or just are you going to take a second language in high school? French was my fourth language. Like
Mm-hmm.
well, I always talk about this with my mom because we always get a kick out of it. People in India like grow up learning three languages at a base, like at a minimum. Um, and so it's already a very ethnocentric perception that, people being bilingual is like, oh my God, like you can speak a second language, or like, oh, have you taken a second language before? Like, have you learned another language before? Um, this is most of the world's lived experience, honest, or I don't know about most, but a lot of the world's lived experience is knowing another language. So there are definitely like little um, like word distinctions that I do like to push back on sometimes, not as like a we have to say this, but have you thought about this a little bit?
Yeah, I think I'm in your camp. If there is a word war or term war going on, I'm usually like on the side of accuracy. It's like, what's the most accurate
Mhm.
term? I'm for that one, which is why I also like ESL. It's like most, I would say most people who are learning English, it's not going to be their second language. It's going to be like you're saying, third or fourth, because in a lot of parts of the world, you've got multiple languages like right next door to you, and you have to use them frequently. Like especially when I was living in Southeast Asia, like there's just so many different languages going on, and I'd be meeting people from Laos and from Myanmar and stuff, and they could all kind of speak a little bit of each other's languages, which was really cool to see.
Yeah.
All right, are you ready to move on to the next thing?
Yeah, sure.
All right, before that, I did want to just address some of the comments here. So let's see what's going on. Haas. Haas is a regular viewer, by the way. Can you see him on the screen, Kritika?
I can. Hello.
Yeah, I tried to do a live stream with Haas, who's one of the viewers,
Oh, wow.
but I didn't know what I was doing, and I messed up the audio. But Haas says, "What definition would you guys give to the word xenophobia? Is there a difference between racism and xenophobia?"
Interesting.
Yeah, what do you think?
I guess xenophobia, I'll just be honest, like I don't really I'm not super attached to definitions, because I'm more of a how are these things used in practice, but I think what comes to mind with xenophobia is um like discriminating against people that are um kind of the other in whatever society that you live in. Um so that could be people from other cultures, it could be, gender diversity, it could be um, any sort of that kind of thing. But I'm not sure if that's accurate, honestly. So,
Yeah, Haas, I would say, for me, xenophobia would be more like, I don't like you if you're from another country. Whereas
mhm.
racism would be like, I don't like you if you're this color.
Mm.
To put it simply, that's kind of
Yeah.
my
Very
take. But
simple.
it's hard because like sometimes if somebody's xenophobic, they don't like people from other countries. They might see someone who they say, oh, that they look like they're from another country, and then at that point, like clearly it's racism. So I would say they kind of get meshed in. Good question though.
Yeah, and a lot of people argue that racism also has like a systemic aspect to it, which is definitely true in a lot of cases. Like xenophobia could be seen as like people's perceptions on the ground versus racism as like a systemic issue
Hmm.
um, perpetuated by either like governments or like societies or anything like that.
All right, let's see. We've got a comment here. Society is slowly realizing the sensitivity around jokes and funny comments or slurs, which is a good change. Slow process, but I'm hopeful. Yeah, I'm hopeful too. And like certainly I always go back to like, my older relatives or older friends because in each generation there are certain things that are considered acceptable, and I'm sure my grandchildren will tell me that I am racist as well. But some of them will change with the times, and then some of them won't. But we'll see what happens. Did you have any comment on that one, Kritika?
No, honestly, I echo the sentiment, and I think that's also why I tend not to be a fan of the word wars because it kind of gatekeeps people that are not on social media, which is usually the older folks. And I think that's why I enjoy more just like listening to people being a little bit more perceptive because it accommodates everyone. You know, it's hard to change your own language if you've grown up with it. So yeah, I echo the sentiment.
All right, and then I think we just have a compliment for you here. Big fan of your accent.
Thank you. I'm not sure what my accent is, but thank you.
Well, I don't know. I get this a lot because I've noticed that my viewers and English learners in general, they notice the distinction between just like individual accents, which is
Mhm.
I think another argument for there's no such thing as a native speaker because even native speakers don't sound like native speakers. Like everyone
Mhm.
has their own way of speaking, and obviously you're going to sound more like the people you're around. So even if it's like, oh, like people from this particular city say the word like, air like for some reason, like what's going
Yeah.
on there? But a fan of your accent, whatever that may mean. All right, and then we have another comment here. Why don't you go ahead and read that one?
Okay, so Jay is saying similar to Black English vernacular, Indian English also has a certain vernacular which locals in India understand, but may not be the best of grammar or formation of sentences. And yeah, this kind of like this happens all the time, honestly, not just with English. I think it happens with like French, where there's creoles in different, you know, island nations and in Africa. Where English has evolved to um, take on different grammar structures. So there's so many dialects of English, and these really can't be considered wrong because it's not like people are just making random mistakes in their English. They're following a pattern. It's just not the pattern that you're used to. And this gets really fascinating because sometimes these patterns reflect their native tongue. So they're like, I don't know if this is the case, but like English in India, the grammar might reflect the grammar of like whatever, like a South Indian language or an Indian language, kind of meshed into English rather than like the grammar of standard English. So,
I can say that I've definitely noticed what you're saying with my students.
mhm.
The grammar that they use in English will often reflect their native language, and it's helpful for me because if they're trying to standardize and if they're trying to follow the grammar of say standard American English, it helps me to understand, okay, like where are you coming from? Oh, so this is why you're saying it
Yeah.
this way. And then I have to explain like, oh, we actually have, this different tense for the past in English. So every time we're going to have to add ed, or if it's an irregular, so on and so forth. Cool. All right. Oh, boom, you got it right.
Awesome.
All right. So I think those are all the comments for now, and we'll take time and answer any other questions that come up. But do you want to talk about sexism?
Oh, yes, I do.
All right.
Um, Sexism in English is, I think it's definitely a little bit more obvious, but I don't, and a lot of this is going to be centered towards women, because women are tend to get the short end of the stick when it comes to anything related to sexism. Um, but where do I start with this? Honestly, let's see. Basically, I think the way this can be categorized is that men and women speak English very differently, and I will get to like trans folks as well. I don't know if there's like a common trans culture in the way that people talk or like gender diverse culture. So my knowledge really does center around men and women, but men and women speak English very differently, and there is this aspect of I think like we talk a lot about hedging when it comes to women's speech, especially in English, which I think is like a good example of where the sexism might come into play. Hedging is basically when you use like any word or phrase to express like ambiguity, probability, caution, indecisiveness. It's basically used to show that you're like not 100% sure of something. You're not saying something very definitively. And we'll see hedging a lot more in women's speech. And this is honestly twofold. So a lot of people will argue, like, oh, hedging. So one thing that women do a lot for hedging is to relate with the audience. But people will see hedging as like a marker of lack of intelligence, because a lot of women will say or right, or they'll say these words that are used to kind of connect with their with the opposite person. If you're talking about let's say you're talking about hardships, you a woman might say working jobs is really hard, as if to say, look, we have a shared experience. If you have gone through this, I get it. Rather than just saying very definitively, working two jobs is really hard, which kind of cuts the other person out of this experience, right? It puts you in your own little bubble. So there's a lot of aspects of women's speech that often get discriminated against. I don't know if you remember maybe learning how to do oral presentations in school, but they would always tell you, try not to say try not to say try not to say these filler words. A lot of these filler words are much more common in women's speech, and they do serve a role. And I think that's a good spot to start with. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. I can certainly go on, but that's one place I like to start with sexism in English.
I was just thinking when you talk about checking in with something like, for me, when I think of that language, that's like effective teaching language. Because if, like, for example, I teach math for the SATs as my day job. And whenever we're going over a new concept, I have to constantly do a sort of, I have to say, okay, so this is how it works. And I'll say, does that make sense to you? Like, explain it to me. Like, you tell me about it. So that just seems like a really effective way of teaching. I'm curious because when it comes to like oral presentations, I feel like removing ums and knows is going to make the presentation clearer. And because you're speaking to so many people, so I see it as, I guess, well, I'm not I can't get feedback from this person because this person is actually like 10,000 people. So so maybe I should remove those. But yeah, that's interesting because one-on-one it seems to make sense, but then if you're on a stage, it just seems more effective not to include those. But I don't know if that's just my male perspective.
It's honestly like there's no clear answer for sure. I definitely think it can be really hard to listen to someone that says a lot, and I don't think is one of the hedges that is very gendered. Really, I think that just depends on like the speaker's comfort level. Um, uh,
I do too.
I think when I started first, like making YouTube videos, that's when I really realized that the way I speak in like a presentation sense is a very certain manner. It's a very precise manner, very definitive. And I found that once I started talking more like myself, or the YouTubers that I really liked, they just talked like themselves. They didn't necessarily have like this presentation voice. Obviously, if you're explaining something, you're teaching something, you should have a level of command that kind of gets rid of these hedges to a certain extent. But I think that also kind of plays into how masculinity is so embedded as like the correct answer in so many things with society. Instead of saying like women should get rid of hedges, I think it's also okay to say hedges can be more common throughout anyone's speech as a way of connecting with your audience. Maybe before there was this kind of perception of we need to be professional as speakers. If you're like presenting material, you need to create a distance, you need to show the power in between the audience and the speaker. But adding hedges, I think, is a great way to connect with an audience, and even with a large audience. I mean, I aside from being a video creator, I'm a dancer. So I'm very used to huge audiences. They're not dancing back, they're not dancing with us, but the way you dance, the way you put out the energy really does affect the whole experience, the whole perception of an interaction. And it is a two-way street, even if one side is silent, which I think is very reflective of language because language is not just, I think there's like weird stats, like language is majority nonverbal communication. So I don't know, that just touches on your aspect of like large audiences. This another thing that I like thought of this in was I also video edit a lot, and sometimes when I'm video editing other people's videos, I will find myself trying to cut out women's hedges. I will find myself trying to edit out their little filler words and then realize that their point is not coming across the way they intended if I cut all of these hedges out.
Mm,
And
interesting.
it's this, and that's like a very industry, example of how you can apply this, like people could argue like I'll just talk how I want to talk and fine, I won't judge other people. But this is how your perception of language being sexist can play out into other fields of like I hedge all the time. I don't think other people are less smart, but still there is this perception in me that, oh, I need to make her sound more professional, like otherwise people would are going to put negative comments. They might think that she's not that smart. And I'm trying to push back against that. And it's difficult because people's perceptions change very slowly.
I feel like is definitely a valuable one
Mm-hmm.
as far as the intention or the message that's coming across, because there is this sense like, oh, this person's trying to connect with me, and almost like, oh, I care about what you say. Like, I'm not 100% sure, like, this is what I believe, but like, do you agree? Yeah, that's interesting. Would as far as hedging goes, would using terms like I think, I believe, would that be considered hedging as well, rather than just stating something as fact?
Yeah, no, that's great that you bring that up because I think that's the part of hedging that really shows the gendered perception that we have of language. And this comes up a lot in professional contexts. Women tend to use these hedges a lot more to sound less direct because direct being direct is an expectation or it's normalized for men, but when women are direct they're perceived as either bossy or they might be perceived as rude or like very just unforgiving. And so if you people talk about this all the time, if you compare women and men's emails, if you compare their texts, if you compare the way they speak in presentations, both could be extremely qualified, but women will kind of supplement their speech a lot more to as a cushion of like being like, oh, I might not be right. And this is really limiting, honest. It's limiting, but it's also again, it's a two-way street. I think we need to stop expecting that women are going to hedge in order to communicate. I think I'm a very direct person. And I in one of my previous jobs, we all our communication was through the computer. Like we would comment on each other's scripts via Google Sheets. We wouldn't really have any video calls. So it was really hard to gauge people's personalities because I had pretty much never spoken to these people. And one of my female coworkers once told me, we eventually became friends, but she told me, I thought you hated me. Like I thought you thought my scripts were horrible because I would leave really direct comments. Like I wouldn't really say like, wow, this is like a great addition, but like I also think you could add this. I would just say, add something about so and so. I think you should remove this. That's how I speak because it's just to the point. That's how I prefer to be.
It's
But I think
efficient.
that was a very, yeah, it is. And I think that was a very gendered perception um, of me because she probably has grown up with that like perception that women need to be really flowery with their speech, be really supplemental. On the other hand, I now work in a workplace that is all women, and women's speech I have found tends to be more accommodating. It tends to be more gentle. It tends to be less it tends to be more forgiving. And that's something I think that men can adapt as well. I think that's another example how masculinity is really embedded into our culture, and femininity is often punished. And a lot of people argue that feminism is really about making femininity not so like quote unquote like childish or bad. Femininity can help everyone, and this aspect of hedging and supplementing your speech is a way of accommodating other people, is a way of showing your openness. It's a way of showing that you're not the final answer, that you're open to more opinions, and that's something that everyone can adapt. So it's definitely a two-way street, and it comes up a lot in professional context, I would say.
If you're trying to communicate with someone, it seems like all of the, I guess, women's speech is just, best practices. You want to check in with the person and let them know that you hear them.
Mhm.
But then on the other hand, I guess like you're saying, if you're trying to get stuff done or help somebody edit something and you don't have a lot of time, I see how being more direct can be effective. I definitely relate because I took a number of creative writing workshops, and
Mhm.
I think I probably came across as kind of a jerk because I'm just like, okay, this is good, this is good. If something was really good, I'd be like, I really like that sentence. But for the most part, it was like, this is unclear. Like,
Yeah.
it's like, get to the point. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and this
Interesting.
comes up in my like friendships as well. Like I notice I'm a lot more because I do identify as pretty direct on if I don't think about societal perceptions, my default will be to be direct. And whenever I'm texting my friends that are guys, I won't think twice about the text that I send. Like I don't put exclamation points and emojis. Like I'll just be like, "Yes, let's do this tomorrow." But with a lot of my girlfriends, it'll be like, oh, did I like do they are they going to think that I'm mad at them? Are they going to think that like I'm not excited to see them because I did put an exclamation point? There's a lot more like just a lot going on with women's texting towards each other, because there's this perception that if we're not chirpy and happy, that we're upset. There's no like neutral with women, and sometimes this is nice. Like sometimes it's nice to have like texts that are like, oh, there's emojis, and like oh, this person's enthusiastic to see me. But it can get really exhausting if that's an expectation of women's speech, especially when I really don't think men have the same expectation at all.
Yeah, I definitely relate to what you're saying there. Like text messages between male friends and female friends, I always feel bad. Like I have some really close female friends that I've known since like early high school, and I will feel obligated to write more to them sometimes because they're writing more to me, and then it's like this whole
Hmm.
thing. Whereas with my male friends, like sometimes I'll even feel like, come on, man, like say more to me, like give me some
Yeah.
love. That's so interesting. On a social level, what we're talking about, I feel like I don't know, most people are aware of it, and okay, yeah, we tend to communicate differently. So when it comes to the ism part of this, rather than,
Mhm.
this is a difference between men and women, the way that they're communicating, when it comes to the ism, would you say that comes from the professional world? Because if you communicate more like, the average male, you're more likely to get into a position of power in a company or something.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it and just the general sense that men are treated as default in our society rather than like there being no gender default. It's often things are often, designed for men, thought of by men for men, and then they're modified for to accommodate women, if that. Or women have to fit into these structures that are designed for men by men. Obviously, not exclusively so, but many of the systems that we have right now are like that. And this is in small ways, of saying man made, or, if a man was standing there instead of saying a person. We have these things embedded into our language, and I think a lot of people will argue, like, oh, it's just how we say things, like men and women. We don't tend not to say women and men. We'll say he or she. We tend not to say she or he, or even better, they. Um, but I think this it's reflective of the fact that language was probably it's okay, so it's interesting because with linguistics, it's often talked about how women are the change makers of language because they are in many societies or for a long time are lesser so in these professional or like office type contexts where their speech is policed. They're more so on the ground. They might be doing more casual things where there's not so many expectations around language and interacting with other women, so they tend to be the change makers of language. But it's really obvious that for so many years, all of the like science, technology, math fields, the places where things were really solidified to what we know as today, they were created by men. So in that way, we can't say that like man-made is a default. We can't say men and women is a default. I really like to push back against these things because they affect little like younger people's perceptions of who they can be in the world. Like there's people that say like woman scientist or woman um like CEO as if your perception is going to be that a CEO is a man. Your perception is going to be that a politician is a man. Um, so I think that's where it comes from. I have very scattered thoughts about this. Um, I don't know if you want to jump in regarding any of that.
Yeah. When you were talking about children, I don't know that I really like everything that you're saying because there's certainly things that I've thought about, but it sounds like you've thought about them with maybe some more discipline and actually like done some research, which is nice. So I feel like I'm like, oh, okay, here's some, facts to back things up, and just thinking about, oh, like you could study emails, you could study voicemails, like especially with social media now, I'm sure there's a lot of ways to track that sort of thing if you're looking for differences in communication. I
Yeah.
was curious if you had looked at all into uh, language sexism in the classroom at a young age. Because I
Mm,
know in general, like the young grade school classroom is one of the few examples where you see, sexism that's directed toward boys. Um, whether it be their handwriting, getting in trouble for behaviors whereas girls won't, things along those lines.
mm.
Did you learn anything, or do you know anything about language in that regard when it comes to, I don't know, I guess writing essays, writing stories, things like that?
Honestly, I don't. Like, if you have something like things to add about that, please do, because I definitely don't know anything about that.
No, I was just wondering. It just when you started mentioning a young age, I was like, huh.
Hmm.
So I was just curious, but that's something I might
No,
want to look into.
yeah. I mean, the one example that people come to a lot is that in like parenting or even school contexts, like boys aren't taught as much to talk about how they feel. And those words, I don't know where it comes from, but at a certain age, it becomes more and more taboo to talk about how you feel. And that's definitely an aspect of like language sexism that impacts men a lot because the culture that is created is that they can't express their emotions. They're expressing your emotions is femininity, and that's bad for some reason. For men to express their emotions, they have to be strong, and so that's definitely the most common example that's taken.
Well, if I'm expressing my emotions, I can't protect my family like the cyborg that I'm meant to be.
Exactly.
I must
What
be
do you mean?
a robot protector. Okay.
exactly. Kind of similar along the lines of school, though, is where like vulgarity comes in or swear words. Um, and there's a really fun show on Netflix called The History of Swear Words, and they do a deep dive into like a lot of the swear words in English. And this is another place where it's really gendered, which is really interesting. Obviously, there are some swear words that, women claim as more that they are allowed to say and men are not. But in general, especially in a school context, you'll start, at least I noticed that guys would swear a lot more than girls did. And then I noticed with my own speech, when I started making friends with guys, I would swear more around them as like a camaraderie, like as a way to show like, oh, I'm one of you guys. Like I can relate to you. I'm cool. Um, and I don't know, that's just another really interesting aspect of language that is very gendered and very like it's a two-way street. It's like, why is vulgarity punished in women, and why is vulgarity even bad? Like, why can't we all claim it? Um, I don't know. I feel like the last speaker that you had on your channel talked a little bit about vulgarity. So I was wondering if you had thoughts about
A
that.
lot of it, yeah. We had an
Yeah.
entire, half of the live stream was about the word ass. So, check out that video. Hopefully I'll remember to leave a link to that video and also to the videos that we mentioned from your channel.
Yeah,
I
I
did
would love
leave
to
a
put
link to the channel
information.
itself, but I'll have to take the time to watch this again and put those links in there as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. And like I said in the beginning, like we can't really touch on sexism without touching on people that are non-binary, gender non-conforming, like the gender spectrum. And there's like I'm still learning so much about this, but there is a very incredible activist. They are called Alok Ved Menon on Instagram and many other platforms, but they are like dismantling gender as a perception in our societies, and it's really interesting to look into their work. And they talked about something that I hadn't even considered, which was about the terms gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, where these terms reinforce the gender binary because they define people as an absence rather than a presence. They define people as an absence of the binary rather than the presence of their own identity.
Hmm.
And I thought that was a really powerful, it's a very powerful segue and a very powerful like part of sexism in language because it goes beyond this idea of like masculinity and femininity being a spectrum and instead removes the fact that language shouldn't have gender in it because gender is like a very diverse experience. Um, so I honestly recommend anyone to check out Alok because they're doing incredible work and it's really eye opening to read all their stuff.
That sounds interesting because you're talking about dismantling like gender within language specifically or just in general.
I mean, in general too, but it's funny that you asked that because I think once you start dismantling it in language, you see a lot more dismantling in society because language is society. Language is how change is often made in our societies, which is why I'm so like passionate about it. I think like to make change, people often are like, I'm not in like policy. I can't, like the billionaires aren't doing whatever they're supposed to do. But on a societal level, I feel like there's so much power we have by paying attention to our language and making it more accommodating, making it more aware of the human experience. And it can create societal change more than we know.
I'm curious about that statement because from everything we've discussed, it sounds like you're very much a descriptivist and not a prescriptivist. Well, actually, could you clarify what that means? You actually know what you're talking about with linguistics. For my students, like what is a prescriptivist versus a descriptivist when it comes to language?
Yeah, there's this really funny perception people have of linguists, where like people will learn that I'm into languages and linguistics, and they'll send me like, oh, they're like, oh, you must be the person that like corrects everyone's grammar, and I
Quite
have
the
to tell them like,
contrary.
no, linguists believe in anarchy. um, so basically, linguistic prescriptivism is the idea that language should be a certain way. And it's often what we're taught in school. We're taught like, this is how you make sentences, this is how you do grammar. And to a certain extent, it's like we need some prescriptivism so that we can understand each other. But at the same time, one could just argue that's just learning the language. Like grammar is not necessarily prescriptivism. Grammar is just like the structure of our language. Whereas descriptivism is very much describing language by the way it's done by the people who speak it, and its emphasis on doing language. So people might say like, oh, this is not a real word in English, like someone made it up. But a descriptivist would say it's a word because someone made it up and people are using it. And prescriptivism and descriptivism get really important when we talk about kind of racist, classist, gendered words. I actually just made a video and like released it yesterday on the words expat and immigrant, and me and Robert were having a conversation about that just before the live stream about maybe a prescriptivist might say, oh, expat and immigrant have distinct definitions, like they have a use, they're different, they're not racist. But by looking at it in a descriptivist context, sure, they might have slightly different definitions. I don't think they really do. But in the real world, how are they being used? Because the way that these words are being used is the language. It's not what a textbook says it is, it's what the people are doing. So, yeah, I would definitely identify a lot as a descriptivist.
Okay, so that said, I feel like, I don't know, for me there's an issue if you're trying to deliberately use language or deliberately change language. That's almost like the opposite of descriptivism, because I guess I see language as this naturally occurring thing. And I mean, obviously if you had a ton of people making a coordinated effort, you could do it. But when language changes, it changes organically. So I'm just curious where you stand in that regard. Was there something else? Oh, darn it. I feel like there was something else, but yeah, just I guess go with that for now.
Well, what do you mean by like changing it? Like you're like trying to change it versus it's changing organically. Like what's an example of trying to change it?
Um, I guess, well, I feel I've noticed that if we're talking about, non-binary,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they as a gender neutral pronoun not only like is organically becoming, but has organically already been a gender neutral pronoun for a very long time,
Mm-hmm.
whereas there's all these other gender neutral pronouns, or like I don't even know what they are
Yeah, yeah,
because it's not happening. But that's
yeah.
like an effort. Somebody's trying to create these pronouns, whereas they seems like the organic thing. So I was just wondering where you stand. Like, do you think efforts are working, or I don't know, or am I not
Yeah,
even
well,
hearing
it's a
what you're
really
saying correctly?
interesting. No, you are completely. And it's an interesting debate. I don't have like a stand on it for sure, but I think it goes back to the idea of power. I think, in by saying they is the organic default, it's the organic default for people that are perhaps gender binary or perhaps that have grown up in a binary way. But I think having those new pronouns is an example of how gender diverse people are kind of claiming that power that they never had and claiming it in a very um, overt and like very loud way. Obviously, like pronouns like they, they're really different. They're not something that like an English speaker might be used to, and it's about discomfort. And I, maybe I think wanting to instigate discomfort for a way of like having power, wielding your power in language, it's a fair ask. I don't really have an opinion either way. I think like I will call people what they want me to call them and try my best because I just want to make people feel comfortable. I want to make people feel good. Um, but I think I'd like to like unpack that a little bit of like organic on whose terms, organic for those whom it's easiest for. Because I think wanting the desire can be considered the organic part as well. Like maybe the change is deliberate, but maybe that desire is very organic. Maybe people as a collective are like, no, we're having this feeling that our language is not diverse enough. It's not accommodating enough. I have this organic desire to change it. Well, you'll have to change it deliberately. Like, you're not just going to start saying random words in place of others, like without trying to. So I guess that's my like slight pushback on that. I wouldn't say I have like a stand per se. Um, yeah.
I guess by organic, I mean in 100 years, like what
Mhm.
stuck, or maybe even just
Yeah.
in 50 years, like what ended up being the word that the masses are using.
Hmm.
Um, because you could argue that, this from now on is a flobber.
Hmm.
And I'm going to get as many people to call this a flopper from now on as possible. I
Hmm.
would argue that if I got like 2,000 people to call this a flopper, I still wouldn't consider this like this is not a flopper. Like, I don't know. I feel like you really need like the majority of people, at least in a dialect or something, to agree. Like, oh yeah, we are using. We don't have to think about it. This is the word. So I guess as far as use goes, that's what I'm thinking of as organic. Um,
Yeah, and
and
with
then the
that, if
way
you
that
think
I
about,
think about it, I guess, is kind of akin to fashion. Like,
mhm,
there are certain things that are acceptable. Like, I don't know anything about fashion, so I don't know how people are judging my shirt. But if you look throughout, the decades, like, oh, during this time it was really cool to wear fanny packs and things like that. I guess I kind of see language as this naturally occurring thing like fashion, but then at the same time what you're saying is would be true because you've got people who are very deliberately trying to be like, we're gonna put cats on our heads and this is the new thing. So I don't know. I feel like
I think,
I'm
yeah,
supporting your
so I have a
argument.
few thoughts on this. Like, I imagine, I don't know when Kleenex was created, but I imagine when Kleenex first came out, it was a weird word. It was like, oh, what's Kleenex? And now tissues are often just called Kleenex in
Mm.
the US at least. Um, and I think what like the gender non-binary or like the gender diverse movement really pushes for, I think, is this comfort with being abundant and comfort with diversity and not conforming to who has originally had power. Um, and it's a really, for some people, it's a really radical idea, right? Like that they could be a pronoun instead of they. I think it's the idea of pushing back onto structure and pushing back onto the idea that like you have to be a certain way. The gender diverse movement's really about accepting that gender is a spectrum and that you could be on that spectrum wherever you want at any given day, and that nobody should care, and that this shouldn't be something that we care about. And I think, like with your 50-year example, like imagine in 50 years, let's say they was a very accepted pronoun.
Hmm.
That is so much power that the gender diverse community has like now stepped into by claiming this into the language. They have been defined constantly by other people. Rarely do gender diverse people get to define themselves as what they're called in society. I don't know how many people agree with Alok about the gender non-conforming or the gender non-binary, but are there were they gender like fluid or queer people? Are they the ones that chose that we're going to be called gender non-conforming, or was that the term offered to them by the people in power? So I
Mm.
feel like it's a pushback on that, and it makes people uncomfortable, but then because it makes people uncomfortable, makes them think, oh, like, who is this structure being prescribed to me by, and is it necessary, is it useful?
All right. Well, I feel like I've learned quite a bit. I know that when we were talking earlier, that you said you didn't have too much to say about classism, and
Mhm.
we've been talking for
We've
quite
been
some
for a
time now.
while.
It's been an hour and 15 minutes, so I think it might be
Yeah,
good to wrap things up. We did
sure.
discuss classism a bit during the racism section
Yeah.
because a lot of the same things do apply. Would you be okay with wrapping things up here?
Yeah, no, that's my thoughts similarly, honestly, because I live in the US, classism is almost inextricably linked to racism. So in a sense they go very hand in hand. So I think, yeah, I think this is a great discussion.
Okay, yeah. I was having too much fun with you talking about the other topics and lost track of time. Well, I just want to thank you again for coming on and teaching me and teaching the viewers here about this hot topic. I have definitely learned a lot, and you've given me a lot to think about. And I almost want to go, back to college and just, go at it with a bunch of students in a classroom. It's so much fun to discuss these sorts of things. And I'd like to just give you a chance to let everyone know where can they find your content, where can they connect with you on social media. So go ahead and share that.
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel, which is I think the best way to keep up with this type of stuff. It's youtube.com/Kritika Sharma Spread Love. So it's my name and Spread Love. I You can also follow me on Instagram, but most of my updates will be on YouTube. I also wanted to my channel, like I said, is about language, culture, and spreading love. So it's a lot more about what we've talked about today, really focusing on like leading with compassion and having more empathy and understanding for the people around you. If you liked these topics, I do want to like point people to resources that are um, made by people that know so much more than me because I'm still learning. So like NPR has some good podcasts like Code Switch and Rough Translation that talk about some of these issues. Um, Amanda Montell is a really up and coming linguist. She's very young and has some awesome books. One of them is called Word Slut, and that really goes into feminism and language, which is an awesome read. And like I said, the history of swear words on Netflix. And I think Gretchen McCulloch is a linguist that really focuses on internet language. She has a book called Because Internet that I haven't read, but she also has a podcast. So these are all really great places to learn more about language and its links to racism, classism, and sexism.
Awesome. And then one more thing. Did you have any final parting words of wisdom for the viewers?
I think one of my parting words would be that I don't think anything can be a binary, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer for anything. What I like to do is really just question what we've been told and question um, kind of societal perceptions of stuff. So that would kind of be my parting word is that try to think a little more deeply about what you've been told is the way to do society, the way to do language. Try to think more deeply about it and think about how you could be more accommodating to those around you. That's the idea behind spreading love. It's just having compassion for other humans, and a lot of the times it's not a black or white answer, it's a very gray area, and that gray area only is answered through listening to people. It's answered through experiencing a lot of humans. Um, and that's I think my favorite part about learning about language and culture that never ends. So thank you so much for having me, Robert. It was a really great pleasure to be here, and I had a really good time in this discussion.
You're very welcome. I had a great time as well, and I'd love to come on your channel sometime and talk more. But thanks, guys, for
Yeah,
watching. Go follow Kritika, all over social media. Subscribe to her channel, and have a wonderful day.